New Zealand First has always put the safety of our police and prison officers as a high priority, so will of course support the bill, and with some enthusiasm. With an increase in severity of assaults on police and prison officers in recent years, we do acknowledge the need for a strong deterrent, and in this I would have to disagree somewhat with my friend Leanne Dalziel, because I think that in the case of inmates in prisons, inmates in prisons who assault prison officers, they may well, in fact I think will, be deterred if they know that the sentence is likely to be significantly more severe than for an assault on any other member of the public. And in addition to that, of course, Parliament itself needs to reinforce the fact that the community will not tolerate assaults on police officers or on prison officers either. And so that's just as important. So we do support the bill, although we are disappointed at the committee's refusal to extend the scope of the coverage for the bill. We note that the aggravating factors to be considered for other people working with prisoners have not been taken into account. They need protection just as much as prison officers do. Other employees of the Department of Corrections will not be covered by the bill, even though they may well be subjected to an assault or harmed by an inmate in a similar way, and they will be excluded simply because they do not come within the title prison officer, even though they still have duties to carry out, for example, rehabilitation work with inmates of prisons, and that means they are in daily contact with the inmates. I am told that the ratio of corrections staff is one prison officer to 20 prisoners. And Esanati Lolly Taylor was one such officer, and she tells me that at most times she was on her own, working up to 30 and sometimes with 44 prisoners, without a prison officer being present, and often was called upon to diffuse situations amongst some of the prisoners where prison officers could not resolve the situation or settle the prisoners down. So you can see that those people, such as those who were in the position of Esanati Lolly Taylor would be just as much at risk of an assault as a warranted prison officer, and yet, for some reason, they are not covered by this bill. She, in her job, was doing exactly the same, if not more than prison officers were, and yet that work is not taken into account. It could in fact be perceived by some as a discrimination against those other staff who do not hold warrants as prison officers. While I applaud the Minister's decision to extend the scope of the bill to cover emergency services workers, I certainly don't applaud the decision not to cover people who work in prisons but are not warranted prison officers. You see, the rationale seems to be that the aggravating factor should cover, in addition to police, warranted prison officers because they are in contact with prisoners and therefore may be assaulted. Well, that's the case with those other people working in prisons too, and yet they're not covered by the bill. So it just doesn't make sense in that way, and that's the source of our disappointment on it. The only reason that I can see having been given for not extending the scope of the bill in that way was simply because it wasn't intended to do that in the first place. And that's a totally inadequate reason. Now, if it's appropriate to extend it now, at this late stage, to emergency workers, then I would have thought that it should have been extended to other people working in prisons who have contact with prisoners but who are not covered because they are not warranted prison officers. So although New Zealand First supports the idea behind the bill, we think that we need to pay attention to the issue that I have raised, and also we ask, in addition to that, are the training programs with police and prison force adequate to assist in avoid the assaults on officers and police officers and prison officers? We think that it would be wise to invest in resources to improve this, and that should be a high priority as well. We believe in a no-nonsense approach for those who lack the respect of persons who uphold and enforce the law, and in particular those who work in prisons, not just warranted prison officers and police. But we don't think that this bill by itself will be likely to change anything unless additional training and resources for prison officers especially is given. We feel that that's an area which is lacking. However, with those reservations that I have mentioned, especially the lack of coverage for people who work in prisons who are not warranted prison officers, New Zealand First does believe that it's a necessary piece of legislation and that it will make a contribution to the safety of the police and people who are warranted prison officers working for the community in prisons, and for those reasons New Zealand First will certainly vote in favour of the bill.
Cool. Ian McKelvey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Throughout my time in public life, the number one priority for our communities has been